War is always painful and full of suffering, and ancient battles were especially brutal. Soldiers fighting in the ranks of the Roman legions faced incredible dangers, and not all of them survived. But what happened to those who managed to escape? It should not be forgotten that at that time there was no modern medicine, and hygiene was very poor. The Roman army, known for its discipline and engineering genius, nevertheless found itself in extremely difficult conditions when it came to health and injuries. Every battle resulted in hundreds, sometimes thousands of wounded, and their fate was decided not only on the battlefield, but also after it. The way in which the aftermath of battles was handled says a lot about the level of development of Roman civilization and its attitude toward human life. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single decision by the command could save thousands of lives and why wounded soldiers were so important to the state. After the battle was over and the battlefield gradually quieted down, the most difficult stage began. Unlike modern armies where the wounded are evacuated by specialized services, in Rome this task was performed by their comrades. Yes, you heard right. Often to avoid chaos and loss of morale, fellow soldiers who had just finished fighting themselves acted as stretcher bearers. It was incredibly hard and dangerous work. Not only did they have to carry the wounded, but they also had to watch out for their own safety, as enemy soldiers or looters could still be on the battlefield. The soldiers were given clear instructions. First, save those who were still breathing and had a chance of surviving. Those who lay motionless were, unfortunately, often left behind. It was a cruel but pragmatic logic dictated by the realities of the time. All this work was done in a hurry, under cover of night or at dawn. The Roman legionaries themselves told how they had to carry their wounded comrades for several kilometers to reach the nearest camp. This created special bonds within the units, turning them into something more than just a group of soldiers. It was important for every legionary to know that if he was wounded, he would not be left on the battlefield. This led to a very unusual approach to mutual assistance. Sometimes healthy soldiers carried the wounded, using their own shields instead of stretchers. Such improvised stretchers were uncomfortable and heavy, but they saved lives. The Romans were the first to establish such a system, which not only saved lives but also maintained morale. It is amazing how this simple solution, using shields as stretchers, helped thousands of wounded soldiers survive. However, caring for the wounded did not end there. Immediately after evacuation, the next equally important stage began: primary medical care. Temporary hospitals, or valetudinaria, were set up at the staging area, where the wounded were examined and given first aid. Unlike other armies of the time, where shamans, healers, or priests were responsible for the wounded, in the Roman army, this was the responsibility of medici, professional military doctors. They not only knew how to apply splints and stop bleeding, but also perform complex operations. These doctors were trained in specialized schools and had vast experience. They honed their skills on the battlefield, which of course improved their qualifications. Roman military medicine was so advanced that it even included the simplest forms of antiseptics. Roman doctors knew the importance of cleanliness and used vinegar, wine, and boiling water as disinfectants. In those days when bacteria and viruses were unknown, this was a real breakthrough. This was especially important when treating wounds. Doctors washed them to prevent infection, which in most cases led to death. The Romans were the first to actively use surgical instruments: bronze and steel tweezers, scalpels, and forceps. These instruments were much more sophisticated than those of other peoples and allowed for more effective operations. But as in any system, there were subtleties. Not all medici were equally experienced. Often doctors with varying levels of training were assigned to the legions, from experienced surgeons capable of amputating limbs to simple medics who performed dressings and simple procedures. Nevertheless, even the basic medical knowledge of Roman soldiers was far superior to that available in other cultures. Moreover, the Romans were among the first to systematize knowledge of medicinal herbs. They used various plants for pain relief, wound healing, and inflammation reduction. Of course, not all of the wounded survived, but thanks to these measures, the survival rate in the Roman army was significantly higher than that of their enemies. The military medical system developed by the Romans was unique for its time and included several key elements: evacuation, field hospitals, and qualified doctors. The Romans understood that the health and combat effectiveness of their soldiers was a key factor in winning wars. Therefore, they paid special attention to this issue, investing in the training of doctors and the production of medical equipment. Even after the end of the war and the disbanding of the legions, many veterans returned home, where they received pensions and land. Those who were wounded received additional assistance. Thus, wounded legionaries became living proof that Rome cared for its heroes, which was a powerful incentive for new recruits. In addition, it was customary in the Roman army to divide responsibilities among medics. For example, capsari were porters who helped transport the wounded from the battlefield to the valetudinaria. A medicus ordinarius was a doctor who was directly involved in treatment. This hierarchy allowed for the efficient allocation of resources and provided better care. The training of medics was long and required a good memory, as much of the knowledge was passed on orally. In schools, doctors studied anatomy and physiology, as well as the basics of surgery. They learned through practice, assisting more experienced doctors. Roman medics were true professionals who, despite the lack of modern technology, performed real miracles. The entire system was very well organized. The Romans understood that well-trained doctors and access to medical care boosted the morale of soldiers. Soldiers were confident that they would not be abandoned in times of trouble and that they would receive qualified assistance if wounded. This undoubtedly played a major role in their psychological state and made them more motivated. Hundreds of years later, many principles of Roman military medicine were adopted by other peoples. However, it is surprising that, despite all their ingenuity and excellent knowledge of engineering and construction, the Romans never thought of mass-producing portable bandages and sterile dressings. This was a major oversight, as wounds, despite all efforts, often became infected, leading to gangrene and amputations. What other unexpected detail of Roman medicine do you think was adopted by other peoples? Write about it in the comments. After wounded soldiers arrived at the camp, they were taken to a special place that could be called the prototype of a field hospital. The Romans called it a valetudinarium. These were special tents where all the wounded were taken. Valetudinaria were always located in the safest place in the camp, far from possible attacks. Special officers were responsible for their organization, and treatment was provided by specialists whom we would today call military doctors. These doctors were usually Greeks, as Greek medicine was considered the most advanced at the time. They had extensive experience and knowledge gained during their training. The valetudinaria had everything that the era could provide: clean water, various instruments, and a set of herbs and ointments for treating wounds. Roman doctors knew the importance of maintaining cleanliness, so they tried to wash their instruments and hands as much as possible. However, unlike today, they had no concept of germs. Their understanding of cleanliness was more intuitive. The tents were divided into several sections: for the seriously wounded, for those who needed amputation, and for those with minor injuries. Each valetudinarium was equipped with beds on which the wounded lay. Soldiers were given clean clothes and blankets to keep them warm. Doctors worked around the clock, providing assistance to all those in need. The doctors were assisted by so-called castrarii, ordinary soldiers who helped carry the wounded, dress their wounds, and perform other tasks. Did Roman soldiers understand the importance of hygiene? And why in some cases was being wounded on the battlefield less dangerous than being in the camp? In addition to medical care, the valetudinaria had a whole system of care and rehabilitation. The wounded were given special food consisting of light broths, bread, and if possible, fresh fruit. Special attention was paid to the psychological state of the soldiers. Doctors and officers talked to them, encouraged them, and told them news from the front. This was not simply an act of mercy, but part of military strategy. The morale of wounded soldiers had to remain high so that they could return to duty as soon as possible. Despite all efforts, conditions in field hospitals were far from ideal. Dirt, overcrowding, and lack of ventilation created the perfect conditions for the spread of infection. Doctors did everything possible to maintain cleanliness, but without knowledge of bacteria, their efforts were often insufficient. Unfortunately, it was in hospitals, not on the battlefield, that many soldiers died of sepsis and gangrene. The slightest scratch, if not treated properly, could be fatal. This was the harsh reality of the time, which had to be faced every day. Doctors in field hospitals were not just medics, but true experimenters. They were constantly looking for new ways to treat patients, trying different herbs and ointments. Some of their methods, such as using wine as an antiseptic, were very effective. Others, such as cauterizing wounds, were very painful and did not always produce the desired result. They learned from their mistakes, recorded their results, and shared their experiences with colleagues. In this way, Roman military medicine was constantly evolving and improving. In addition, the Roman legions had a well-coordinated evacuation system. There were people in the camp itself who were responsible for transporting the wounded to the valetudinaria. They were specially trained in how to carry the injured correctly so as not to cause them further harm. In the event of large-scale battles, when the number of wounded was particularly high, even combat chariots could be used to transport them. Of course, this was a rare occurrence, but the fact itself speaks volumes. The Romans took the issue of saving the lives of their soldiers very seriously. However, despite all these measures, wounded soldiers continued to die. And it was not only due to a lack of knowledge about germs. Doctors often faced a problem that we would today call traumatic shock. The mortality rate was very high, and doctors did not know how to treat it. They tried to calm the victims and gave them painkillers, but this was often not enough. This chapter gives us a glimpse behind the scenes of the Roman military machine, showing that even in the most brutal times, people sought to help one another, and that in this system, which seems so unshakable and ruthless, there was room for both mercy and compassion. It was a time when human life was valued not only on the battlefield, but also in the field hospital. It was this approach which emphasized not only treatment, but also care for the wounded, that became the foundation for modern military medicine. The Romans were pioneers in many fields, and medicine was one of them. Their knowledge and experience, passed down from generation to generation, saved the lives of thousands of soldiers, ultimately making their army one of the most powerful in history. But what if these medical achievements were only one side of the coin, and the other side was incredible cruelty and ruthlessness? Can we consider progress paid for with hundreds of thousands of lives to have a bitter taste? Watch the video below to find out the answer to this question. The medical instruments used by Roman doctors were remarkable for their time. They were not simply made from materials at hand, but were specially crafted. Each Roman legion had its own set, which was carried with the army. These kits were standardized and included a whole arsenal of different tools. Among them were special forceps for removing arrowheads that could become deeply embedded in the body. There were also surgical knives made of high-quality steel, which were very sharp and thin. Saws were used for amputations, and special needles and threads made from plant fibers or thin animal tendons were used to stitch wounds. They also had special devices for setting dislocations and fractures. Roman surgeons were true masters of their craft. They were able to perform complex operations, such as trepanation of the skull, to relieve pressure on the brain after a traumatic brain injury. They had their own methods of anesthesia. They used opium, belladonna, or mandrake to alleviate the suffering of the wounded during operations. Of course, this was very dangerous, as an overdose could lead to death. But in the conditions of that era, it was the only way to help a person. Every such action was fraught with enormous risk. Nevertheless, thanks to their courage and skill, Roman surgeons saved many lives that would otherwise have been lost. The scissors used by Roman doctors were perhaps one of the most versatile tools in their arsenal. They came in different sizes, from large ones for cutting skin and tendons to small, thin ones for more delicate procedures. These scissors not only allowed for precise cuts, but also helped remove dead tissue, which was critical for preventing infection. Although doctors had no concept of sterilization as we understand it today, they tried to thoroughly wash their instruments in boiling water or wine. This, of course, did not destroy all germs, but it significantly reduced the risk of infection. In addition to standard instruments, there were also more specialized ones. For example, to remove bone fragments or other foreign objects from the body, Roman surgeons used curettes. These were curved metal instruments with a small hook at the end. They allowed the wound to be cleaned of fragments with high precision without causing additional damage to the tissues. They also had special enemas for washing the intestines and treating various diseases of the gastrointestinal tract. These tools show how comprehensive Roman medicine was and how much attention they paid to even the most insignificant details. Doctors often encountered wounds caused not only by swords and arrows, but also by stones or clubs. To treat such injuries, they used special metal probes that allowed them to determine the depth of the wound and the presence of internal damage. These probes were incredibly thin and flexible, allowing doctors to examine the wound without enlarging it. To stop bleeding, they used bronze clamps and tweezers. In more severe cases, when bleeding was particularly heavy, the wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron, which was very painful but often saved lives. Roman medicine was so advanced that in some regions there were even military medical academies, where future doctors studied anatomy and surgery. These academies used teaching aids that were true works of art. Various parts of the body, muscles, and bones were depicted on parchment. This helped students better understand human anatomy and prepare for their future work on the battlefield. Their knowledge was passed down from teacher to student and constantly supplemented with new discoveries. But perhaps the most surprising thing in the Roman doctor's arsenal was prosthetics. Yes, you heard right. Despite the lack of modern technology, the Romans were able to create primitive but functional prosthetics for those who had lost limbs. These prosthetics were made of wood, metal, or leather and allowed soldiers to return to normal life, albeit with difficulty. This was a manifestation not only of skill, but also of humanism. The Roman state considered it its duty to care for its veterans, and prosthetics were one way of showing this care. After a wounded soldier had been treated and declared fit for service, he returned to his legion. This usually took from several weeks to several months, depending on the severity of the injury. During this time, he regained his strength and doctors monitored his condition. Soldiers who suffered serious injuries that made them unfit for military service were not thrown out onto the streets. The Roman state took care of its veterans. Such soldiers received a so-called pension, which was given in the form of a plot of land. This plot of land was usually located in the provinces, where they could establish their farms and continue to live. This was not done out of pure altruism, but for pragmatic reasons. The state thus developed new territories, and veterans, being reliable citizens, strengthened Roman influence in these regions. In this way, a wounded soldier could start a new life, receiving land as a reward for his service. On the other hand, those who suffered minor injuries quickly returned to duty. Their experience and combat skills were valued, and they were sent back to the battlefield. However, even after full recovery, they always carried reminders of their injuries with them, scars that were signs of distinction and pride. This is why veterans were so highly valued in the Roman legions. They carried not only combat experience, but also the memory of many battles. Roman legionaries were well aware of the importance of medicine. Each legion had special medical units consisting of trained doctors known as medici. These specialists had a deep knowledge of the anatomy, surgery, and traumatology of their time. They used a variety of instruments, including scalpels, tweezers, and probes, and applied herbal decoctions and ointments to treat wounds and stop bleeding. Field hospitals, or valetudinaria, were an integral part of legionary camps. They were well-organized and clean facilities where wounded soldiers received skilled care. In valetudinaria, soldiers were not only treated for their wounds, but also underwent rehabilitation, returning to a full life. This allowed Rome to retain its best personnel without losing them to injury. However, even the most advanced medical knowledge of the time did not always help. Many soldiers had to have limbs amputated, which of course put an end to their military careers. But in this case, they were not left to fend for themselves. The state took care of them, providing them not only with land but also other forms of compensation. Did Roman soldiers always receive land after service, or were there other forms of compensation? But before answering this question, let's figure out how treatment and rehabilitation actually took place. Because it's no joke to sew up a wounded soldier so that he doesn't return to duty with an extra leg. The answer is below. Once the operation was successfully completed, an equally important stage began. Post-operative care. The wounded soldier was transferred to a separate bed where he was cared for by the doctor's assistants. The main task was to prevent infection. Doctors knew that dirt could lead to suppuration and death, so they regularly changed the bandages, which were made of clean linen cloth. Various compounds were used to treat wounds: honey, vinegar, and wine. The Romans intuitively understood that these substances had antiseptic properties. Honey, for example, prevented the growth of bacteria. Vinegar and wine also helped clean the wound and speed up healing. In addition, to prevent swelling and relieve pain, the wounded were given decoctions of various herbs, such as chamomile or sage. Rehabilitation also played an important role. Soldiers with fractures were given wooden splints to immobilize their limbs. After the bones had healed, they underwent special exercises to restore joint and muscle mobility. These exercises were similar to modern therapeutic gymnastics. Soldiers gradually worked on their joints to return to duty as soon as possible. Much attention was also paid to nutrition. The diet of wounded soldiers was rich and high in calories to provide their bodies with enough energy for recovery. They were given easily digestible foods such as broths, porridge, and fresh fruit. Wine was diluted with water to prevent dehydration and used as an additional source of nutrients. Proper nutrition combined with quality care significantly increased the chances of survival and a speedy return to service. However, even the best care could not always save a soldier. In cases of severe injuries or amputations, his life was changed forever. Such veterans, unable to continue serving, were not left without state assistance. In addition to the land they received as a pension, they could also be provided with other types of compensation, such as a large lump sum payment. This allowed them to start a new life by opening a small business or simply living off the income from their land. Some veterans whose injuries prevented them from fighting, but did not prevent them from performing other duties, remained in the Legion as instructors or administrative staff. Their experience and knowledge were invaluable for training new recruits, as well as for keeping records and managing logistics. This was another way for the state to provide for its veterans by using their skills and experience for the benefit of the entire Legion. Thus, the system of care for the wounded and veterans in the Roman Empire was multifaceted and well thought out. It included not only medical care, but also social support, which allowed wounded soldiers to remain part of society. This care, in turn, contributed to the morale and loyalty of the legionaries, as each of them knew that if they were wounded, the state would not abandon them. Caring for soldiers, both on the battlefield and after it, was one of the foundations of Rome's military power. The Roman army was known for its organization, and the medical service was no exception. Each legion had its own medical team, consisting of a chief physician and his assistants. They were highly paid specialists and enjoyed a high status. Their work was incredibly important, as the combat effectiveness of the army depended directly on it. The command understood that wounded soldiers were not just a burden, but a valuable resource. Every trained legionary was expensive, and losing one was undesirable. Therefore, the Romans invested heavily in the development of military medicine. Doctors had access to the best tools and medicines, and their experience was passed down from generation to generation. Medical units accompanied the army on campaigns, and their main task was to be always ready to provide assistance. They did not participate in battles, but remained in the rear, in the camp, where they set up their valetudinaria. This system allowed them to provide assistance as quickly as possible, which significantly increased the chances of survival. Despite all its achievements, Roman medicine could not always help. Many soldiers suffered injuries that prevented them from returning to duty. In such cases, their lives changed forever. Amputation of limbs, loss of sight, or other serious injuries meant the end of their military careers. However, the Roman state did not abandon its veterans to their fate. This was a pragmatic approach based on the understanding that the loyalty of soldiers directly depended on how well the state cared for them. Soldiers who knew that they would be taken care of in the event of serious injury were prepared to fight with greater courage. Veterans who were unable to serve in the military received a pension in the form of a plot of land. These plots were usually located in the provinces, which allowed the state to develop new territories and strengthen Roman influence. In addition to land, some veterans received a large lump sum payment. This gave them the opportunity to start a new life, open their own business, or simply live off the income from their land. Such a reward was not only a gesture of gratitude, but also a powerful incentive for other soldiers who saw that their service was valued. Another form of reward was the opportunity to remain in service, but as an instructor or administrative worker. Veterans who had suffered injuries that did not prevent them from performing non-combat duties could pass on their invaluable experience to new recruits. They taught them tactics, discipline, and survival on the battlefield. This not only provided veterans with work, but also strengthened the army, making it more professional. Their knowledge and skills were worth their weight in gold, and their presence in the camps reminded young soldiers of the importance of military duty. Overall, the system of care for veterans in the Roman Empire was well thought out and effective. It created a strong bond between the state and the army, ensuring the loyalty of soldiers and the stability of society. But what happened to those who suffered serious injuries? Have you ever wondered what happened to those who lost an arm or a leg in battle? Were they simply given a piece of land and sent home? We will tell you more about this later. Even after full recovery, many Roman soldiers were unable to return to a full life. Severe injuries left deep scars, loss of limbs, blindness, chronic pain. All these problems could lead to dismissal from service. However, the state did not abandon such people. Veterans who could no longer fight received special support. As already mentioned, they could be allocated land, but there were also other forms of assistance. For example, they could be assigned to light administrative work in the rear, where they could be useful to the state without participating in battles. They could also receive regular benefits that allowed them to support their families. This was part of Roman social policy, which was aimed at maintaining the loyalty of citizens and creating stability in society. The Romans understood that dissatisfied veterans could become a source of problems, so they tried to provide them with a decent life. Thus, injury did not always mean the end of a career, but only a change of occupation. The Roman government also recognized that psychological trauma was no less dangerous than physical trauma. Soldiers who had survived brutal battles and witnessed the death of their comrades often suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Although the term PTSD did not exist at the time, the Romans intuitively understood that such people needed special support. Veterans returning from war were integrated into society and given the opportunity to engage in peaceful work. This helped them adapt to civilian life and forget the horrors of war. Among veterans who had been wounded, those who continued to serve, even in administrative positions, were held in special esteem. They were called emeritus, meaning retired. Their experience and knowledge were invaluable for training new recruits. They acted as instructors, sharing tactics, discipline, and survival skills on the battlefield. This not only provided veterans with work, but also strengthened the army, making it more professional. Their presence in the camps reminded young soldiers of the importance of military duty and that even after being wounded, they could still be useful to Rome. Another form of social support was the opportunity for veterans to receive land in colonies. Colonies were new settlements founded by the Romans in conquered provinces. Veterans who received plots of land there became not only landowners, but also the foundation of a new Roman community. They strengthened Roman influence in the region by bringing Roman culture, laws, and order there. It was a mutually beneficial partnership. The state gained reliable citizens in new territories, and veterans gained a decent life after service. This well-thought-out system of caring for veterans was one of the reasons for the longevity and strength of the Roman Empire. Soldiers, knowing that the state would not abandon them in times of trouble, fought with greater courage and loyalty. Caring for soldiers, both on the battlefield and after it, was one of the foundations of Rome's military power. In addition to physical injuries, soldiers also suffered psychological trauma. Constant participation in battles, witnessing the death of comrades, and the fear they experienced all left their mark. Today, we would call this post-traumatic stress disorder, but in ancient Rome, such a term did not exist. Roman doctors had no knowledge of psychology, but they intuitively understood that soldiers needed support. It was believed that socializing with comrades, eating together, and participating in religious ceremonies helped restore mental balance. In addition, veterans could share their stories, which also helped them cope with the stress they had experienced. Roman religion also played a major role in this process. Soldiers believed that the gods protected them and that they were fighting for a just cause. This gave them strength and helped them cope with the horrors of war. Participating in sacrifices and festivals dedicated to the gods of war helped them return to normal life. Returning to peaceful life played an equally important role in rehabilitation. The state provided veterans with land so that they could engage in agriculture. Working the land, starting a family, and participating in community life helped soldiers forget the horrors of the past. It was a kind of therapeutic approach that allowed them to find a new place in life and feel useful to society. In addition, many veterans continued to maintain close ties with their former comrades even after leaving the service. They formed veterans' communities where they could socialize, share experiences, and help each other. It was a kind of social network that provided them with support and a sense of belonging. In these communities, veterans found understanding and respect, which was especially important for those suffering from the psychological effects of war. Roman society as a whole treated veterans with great respect. They were considered heroes who had given part of their lives for the good of Rome. This attitude, in turn, helped them adapt and integrate into civilian life quickly. Veterans often held high positions in local government, became respected members of the community, and enjoyed authority. In this way, the Roman state and society created conditions in which soldiers who had suffered psychological trauma could not only survive but also lead full and dignified lives. Medical education in Rome was well developed. Doctors learned from their mentors and also studied the works of great Greek physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen. They underwent lengthy training, during which they learned about anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology. Medical knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, and military doctors, having gained practical experience in campaigns, returned to Rome and became civilian doctors, spreading their knowledge throughout the empire. This exchange of experience was incredibly important. Military medicine developed new methods and techniques that were later adopted by civilian medicine. Much of this knowledge was recorded in medical treatises that have survived to this day. For example, the works of Galen, who was the personal physician of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, contain numerous descriptions of various injuries and methods of treating them. These texts became the basis for the development of medicine for many centuries. The high level of military medicine was of great importance to the Roman state. It allowed the army to remain combat-ready by reducing casualties. Soldiers were confident that they would receive help if wounded, which boosted their morale. In addition, caring for veterans contributed to social stability. Soldiers returning from war who received land or other support became reliable citizens who strengthened Roman power in their local communities. They served as role models for young people who saw that military service was not only honorable, but also guaranteed them a decent future. The spread of medical knowledge through military doctors had long-term consequences for the entire empire. Returning from the front, experienced medics opened private practices in cities and provinces, training new students. They brought with them advanced treatment methods tested in the field, which significantly improved the level of healthcare for the entire population. This constant circulation of knowledge and experience created a solid foundation for the development of medicine as a science and as a profession. Doctors who had served in the army enjoyed special authority, as their qualifications had been proven in practice, under the harshest conditions. Thanks to this, valetudinaria, private hospitals modeled on military hospitals, began to appear in Roman cities and even in small settlements. Not only soldiers were treated there, but also civilians. This shows that military innovations did not remain within the army, but became the property of the whole society. Although not accessible to all segments of the population, this healthcare system was significantly superior to the level of medical care in other states of that time. The legacy of Roman military medicine can be traced to the present day. Many principles of the organization of the medical service, including the division into field hospitals and stationary clinics, are still used in modern military and civilian medicine. The use of antiseptics, surgical instruments, and rehabilitation methods, which were first tried out by Roman military doctors, formed the basis of many modern medical practices. It is important to note that Roman care for veterans also influenced public policy. Social programs aimed at supporting former soldiers became a model for many subsequent states. The Romans were the first to understand that investing in veterans was not just an expense, but an investment in the stability and prosperity of the country. This policy created a powerful feedback loop. Soldiers, knowing that their labor would be rewarded, fought with greater dedication, and veterans who received support became loyal citizens. Thus, Roman military medicine and social policy toward veterans were intertwined and served a single purpose: to strengthen the state. They demonstrate that the success of the Roman Empire was due not only to military strength, but also to a well-thought-out system of government that valued every citizen. This legacy lives on in our modern ideas about military medicine and the social responsibility of the state toward those who defend it. We have learned how Roman civilization dealt with one of the most difficult problems: wounds on the battlefield. Their approach was surprisingly pragmatic and humane for its time. They created a system that saved the lives of thousands of soldiers. And this was one of the factors in the success of the Roman Empire. We've talked a lot about how the Romans treated the wounded, but what do you think was their most significant medical achievement in terms of history? Write about it in the comments. And to make sure you don't miss our new videos about the ancient world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.